We're going to start today's session with Seksom Suriyapa. Seksom is a partner now, very, very newly a partner at Upfront Ventures. I've known Seksom for a very, very long time and invited him to talk today, primarily, however, not as a venture capitalist, but as a veteran of the corp dev world. We've been having a lot of conversations here about exit strategy. And in prior sessions, you have listened to speakers discuss, bootstrapping to exit and various nuances of how acquirers, the buy-side acquirers, do acquisitions, how do they think of acquisitions, and so forth. So we will continue that conversation today with Seksom. Seksom, welcome to the show. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Ramana. Just so grateful to be here and just admire your work and what you do for entrepreneurs. So excited to share.
So Seksom, let's start with, I know you are very time compressed today, so I will be very mindful of that. But let's start by having you talk a little bit about your background in corp development, doing acquisitions from the buy side, from various very significant companies before you switched to the venture side.
Yes, no, yes, I've had now 4 stints. It's hard for me to believe as a corp dev leader during my career. I've been at Twitter, SuccessFactors, Akamai, and McAfee. Just hearing that list, you could probably appreciate that it's an unusual list to string together because it really reflects kind of everything from the very bottom of the stack to the top of the stack. So I think I'm fairly unique in that way. I think what's most notable about the times I spent is I've been lucky to be with companies at an important strategic inflection point. So you may remember at SuccessFactors where I was for 6 years. I joined, basically when it was pretty much like a one product company, performance and goals. And I had the opportunity to really build out the product suite with the product leadership team, which then ultimately led to the sale of the business to SAP for what was then the highest software multiple of all time. And then more recently at Twitter, I had been part of the team that really was in place to accelerate the pace of innovation to really meet market needs.
So these are different motivations. Let me see if I can, facilitate a synthesis of how you think about acquisitions, what to acquire and why. And these are, you just cited 2 very different motivations. So explain how you acquire and why. And I'm going to focus on the buy side in the interest of time. It would be very interesting to learn the SuccessFactors to SAP deal, but for the moment, let's put that a bit on the back burner and talk about what you acquire. Our audience, as you know, we work primarily with early stage companies. We love capital efficient companies. So in that spectrum, how do you think of acquisitions, both on the B2B side and on the B2C side?
Yeah, so look, I think really the first thing is as a corporate acquirer, what's really key is knowing where your company is headed, which really sounds trite, but sometimes not always the case. So for me, like strategy comes first, which is defining strategically where the company's headed. So as I said, in the example of SuccessFactors, it was very clearly, it's going to build out a product suite. What is a product suite? In what order do you stack rank a product suite? The second piece around thinking about acquisitions is like, once you know where you're headed, you have to really bear in mind, even as a corp dev leader, that it's really one of 3 ways to get to the goal of executing the strategy. There's obviously internal organic build. There's often an opportunity to OEM, and then finally there's acquisition. And so I feel that part of my job as a corp dev leader was always not to try to shill a deal and get a company to do an acquisition. It was really to force the company to think through the 3 alternatives and then determine that acquisition is the best way to accomplish that.
this is what you're saying is very interesting. Do you view OEM as a stepping stone to an acquisition happening?
Yes, it can often be. There are at least a couple of examples I can think of at Twitter, and because Twitter's been relatively private about how it talks about itself, I won't probably name company names as I'm talking about it. But as an example, at Twitter, we were looking at spam filtering as an area, and we ultimately bought a company in that space. In fact, it was an acqui-hire. And minimally capitalized, so very much down kind of your fairway. But before the acquisition, we ended up kind of OEMing the product, and through the work of OEMing and discovering kind of both the talent of the team as well as the capability of the product, it very quickly moved to acquisition. So it's definitely a path. But I think that companies often tend to kind of go between buy or build, and sometimes don't really examine that middle zone, which can often be the right answer.
Very good. Now, let's actually take this example that you started with. It's always easier to explain things with case studies.
Yeah.
Who drives acquisitions? Is it the product leaders or corp dev? How do you find out about this company that you ended up considering an OEM deal with, and that finally led to an acquisition?
Yeah, so no, great question. So let me start with, in a very perfect world, I personally am biased towards believing that the product leader is the one who drives an acquisition. I want to be clear that the world is never perfect, and one of the challenges I think on the sell side is to understand like who really is driving the acquisition, because a lot of companies, it's a moving target and you get passed around a lot. But in the case of Twitter specifically, it's always the product leader who is ultimately the decider, so to speak. And corp dev is really there as a collaborator and kind of driver of the deal, but not a decider. And so in this case, product had an agenda to, in this case study, to have to figure out, how to filter spam better on the platform. And so the way it would work is, you want to keep product focused on product releases, and therefore, when the two teams are tightly aligned, it's kind of like bringing corp dev into the strategy, kind of explaining what the qualification criteria are for the types of companies they would be interested in, and then giving corp dev a leash to go out and basically scout broadly and find as many of these types of companies as possible, and then start to vet both which would work from the technical perspective, but then also like which teams feel like they would work well from kind of a Twitter culture point of view. And then once that process has whittled down the list to, a few of the top candidates, that would be typically where product then will become much more part of the process.
Seksom, how do you orchestrate the scouting process? One of the things that we always consider is kind of staying on the radar of a potential acquirer from the sell side. So
yes.
How do we do that, and how do you on the buy side, cast your net or, keep yourself abreast of what's happening in the industry and various aspects of the industry?
Yeah. Well, so I think, I'll start from the buy side, but then I'll go to the sell side. On the buy side, look, I think in my case particularly, I've been blessed with like being a kind of, I'll quote unquote, like the branded company in the space, so to speak. And so we always had great success in finding companies that were relevant, either because, their investors made sure they were on our radar, or, our often in Twitter in particular, there's a really strong network of entrepreneurs who maintain contact with one another. And, usually an entrepreneur would find a way to get to Twitter through another entrepreneurial contact.
Yep.
And so I think that, ultimately, like turning to the sales side of it, I think there are a couple of ways. I've obviously already mentioned a few, which is use your network and get to the company. The two doors that are usually open are corp dev, who's always interested in talking to as many companies as possible and get to know them early. And then the other door is really the product side. And then there, I think most savvy entrepreneurs will find a way to network their way to the business. I think the third way that it's seldom as appreciated but very important is, I think particularly if you're on the enterprise side, is either if you have common customers, which is an excuse
Yep.
to talk to each other, to kind of meet in the field and, you know, come up with an idea where there's like an interesting joint value proposition that you can bring to the other side. I think the other thing which really gets you on the radar of an enterprise company is when you win customers in sales cycles against them. And so like if you know you're regularly
Mhm.
beating somebody, this is actually a great way to get you on the radar of that somebody because they don't like to lose if they're playing against you.
Yep. Great. And, I want to underscore one thing to our listeners here. You always feel like, oh, are they going to talk to us? On the corp dev side or on the product side of the acquiring company, oh, are we too early? Are they going to talk to us, etc.? Actually, they want to know about you as
Yes.
much as you want them to know about you. So it's a motivation on both sides of the equation to get acquainted. So please
Yes.
do not underestimate the importance of making that introduction through your network, through other fellow entrepreneurs, through us, through anybody who can intro you into that company, maybe potential customers or joint customers, competitors, etc. But you want to be on people's radars. People
Yes.
cannot acquire you if they don't know about you, and you could be too small and they haven't found out about you yet. You want to make sure that you are on the radar of potential acquirers.
Yeah, and I'd
Seksom,
love to. Yeah, I'd love to build on that point, Sramana. I think the other
yes,
thing I'd note as a buyer is that the places where I've seen it most successful is where you've been able to build a relationship and you actually know
yes,
each other long before the sale is something that's going to be imminent. And that's just because all these things are very relational. And when a company
yes,
buys you, they're buying you because not just because they like your technology and your product, but they believe you're going to fit and they believe that you're motivated and aligned with the mission and that you have people that will be aligned with that mission. And so if you only approach companies when you're ready to sell, there really usually isn't quite enough time to have that form of discovery. And so like it's harder for a
right.
buyer to have conviction.
Yeah, very, very true. Um, what role does valuation play in whether an acquisition happens or not, Seksom?
Yeah, I this is kind of a tough one because I think the reality is that it tends to be the issue on whether a deal happens or not. And that's because very professional corp dev teams you know are usually highly disciplined around how they value deals, and what are the norms that they use around them. And then similarly in the case of venture backed on companies in particular, they have investors that kind of similarly are you know looking at the end of the day to maximize investor returns. And then that kind of constant tension between the two causes these deals to be very valuation driven when in fact there are a lot of other factors beyond valuation that are important. Now if I turn to the seller side of this equation, I would say one thing, which is I think for sellers it's often very difficult, particularly bootstrapped and minimally capitalized ones in the process, because there is often an asymmetric advantage that buyers have because like sellers often are selling their first ever business and they don't have as many reps at doing that, whereas buyers are doing this all the time. They have typically will have better information. And so the thing that I would advise sellers around is that in order to have a successful sale process, if you've determined you're going to sell, you have to have like credible options that give you an opportunity to create what I call pricing tension in the process. Like, you never want to have one potential buyer. You want to have several that, you know, are viable, that you're moving along at a pace that's more or less parallel to one another. Because when you get to the end, if you only have one potential buyer, you don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of pushing value. Whereas if there is tension in the process, this is what allows you to achieve kind of, you know, better prices. And then the last point I'd make is that it was similar to my point around using your network. You really want to, if you don't have sophisticated investors who put money into you, you want to make sure you're leveraging people who are savvy in the tech world, who kind of understand or have sold businesses, whether that's other entrepreneurs, a mentor advisor, it could be even like a great deal lawyer that works with you, but you do want somebody in your corner.
Yeah. And what are the drivers? You know, how do you, from the buy side, value deals that would be helpful for the entrepreneur on the sell side to be aware of?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. You know, one is, if it's an acqui-hire, what is most typical is that, you know, companies will value those businesses purely on a, what I call like a dollar per product headcount multiple. And so the reason that may be relevant to an entrepreneur is that, to the extent that you have kind of a lot of commercial people around, you need to understand that an acquirer really doesn't value the commercial people when it's looking at an acqui-hire. It's purely how many product and engineering people are on board. And so this is like an equation you kind of have to understand when you're doing that. The other thing that's important, whether it's acqui-hire or really any type of deal with, you know, small private company, is buyers want to optimize for more money going to team and employees than investors. And so, like,
Yeah.
you know, I know we'll get to this a little bit later, but in a way, like, and now I'm speaking against myself as a venture capitalist, but in a way, like, buyers love the world where almost all the money, if not all of it, goes to the entrepreneurs and the people who built the product and so on, than having to give any of the money to the outside. I mean, it's a necessity in many cases, but it's clearly a preference if it's possible.
So, which is a good segue into the discussion on bootstrapping to exit, which comes up a lot in our quarters. We have had several bootstrap to exit deals, very thinly capitalized companies or completely bootstrapped companies that we have had exits with. Now, what is that equation? If it's a tech talent-based multiple, you know, acquisition price in an acqui-hire situation, what is the current thinking on that?
Yeah, so I would say this. The biggest, probably the biggest leap in terms of valuation at the end of the day is literally whether it ends up being a so-called tech and talent deal versus an acqui-hire deal. I mean, an acqui-hire deal, realistically, those are not going to be like a rich value. What you're really looking for as an entrepreneur clearly is having not just, you know, a product, but that you can show a product market fit. So I would tend to, like, where I divide it is like acqui-hires tend to be like finished the product, didn't prove product market fit, unlikely to have any commercial success. Tech and talent deals that have the potential to have higher multiples are product complete, very early signs of product market fit. If the company chose to raise another round, the buyer will have the feeling that this company could continue to scale. And so in some ways,
Yes.
that's where they start to pay what I would call closer to a company market multiple, that is extrapolated from both company comparables in the public space as well as private comparables in kind of venture landscape. And then the third, variety, which is a more mature variety of it, is where like you're actually having commercial success and your metrics are scaling, and the art is you want to be selling at the moment where things don't appear to be slowing down but are accelerating, because anytime there's acceleration, that's where a company feels pressure to pay up, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yes. So I'm going to double click down on your second category, which is you have product market fit. The options are, do we sell the company now or do we go for another round of funding? If we choose to go for another round of funding, we will get funded because we have product market fit and we have customers and so forth. So in that scenario, how does valuation compare in an exit versus a funding valuation?
Yeah, so I believe that this is where things get really tricky, because I believe that because of where the venture capital market is today, which, I would argue in some ways is a bit probably frothier than like where an acquirer is willing to pay. I think often the sticker price on getting venture money will look very attractive from a valuation point. Like if you're just comparing dollars from a valuation point of view. But I think where the tension is for the entrepreneur is twofold. So one is when you raise money at a relatively high valuation, because that's where the venture market is pricing you, you're also now building in an execution ramp that you need to execute to in milestones that could potentially be heroic, because you do actually have to grow into these valuations through execution. Whereas on the sell side, if you decide to sell, even though those dollars on a nominal, I'll make it up, like the venture market may say you're 100, but the buyer market might say I'll pay you 50 in cash today. The difference between the two, honestly, is if you get the 50 in cash today, you have whatever return you have, and now the execution risk has really, in a way, passed to the company. Not like you don't personally now have the execution risk of, hey, can I ramp either revenues or users to the point where I could justify the fact that I just got valued at 100 million, even though like I'll call it like rational multiples say I'm worth more like 50.
Yeah, very good. Now, what tension do you experience in negotiating with companies that have a lot of venture capital versus the ones that have smaller amounts of capital? And and this is particularly relevant right now, given that the valuations are ballooning absolutely.
Yes.
Given what's happening in the venture market today, how would these companies ever find strategic exits? They're all thinking that they're all going to be unicorns, they're all going to go public, and the public market is going to support this kind of valuation. How are these companies ever going to find strategic exits?
Yeah. So I guess I'd say it this way, which is the reason you do see valuations like this is that in some ways, like the market has proven out that it is actually possible to have like multi tens, if not low hundreds of millions of dollars exits, which, because you've been around for a while too, it wasn't something that really happened 10 years ago, right? Like I talked about Success Factors being the highest software multiple of all time when it sold in, I think it was 2011, I've forgotten now, but that was only like a $3.4 million deal, a $1 billion deal, which is a pittance, right, in today's world. And so I think what I'd say is that entrepreneurs do have a belief that right now, and maybe investors too, that the trees will just continue to grow to the skies because they have seen, they see Stripe as, showing that there's a potential to get there. You see valuations like Coinbase and so on. And so I think there is this natural tendency to think that you can be the one to get there. I mean, entrepreneurs are inherently optimistic. But I would probably flip it around. I'm a bit old-fashioned and still believe that, at the end of the day, what you want to do as a business owner is to control your own destiny, and that you should capitalize yourself as much as you need to get to your next milestones, and you should be very rational about like what level, kind of what level of scale you believe the business will achieve, kind of when it achieves its journey. Different companies will get to different scale, and think a lot about like what is a great return on the investment you've put into it, both in terms of sweat and possibly in terms of money, and realize that when the when the tide finally turns, the companies that will do okay are the ones that actually build real businesses and have been able to execute and grow, and not because they were fueled by lots of excess capital, but they had inherently strong business models, with, again, old fashioned, but real unit economics and so on. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
I'm probably not as in favor of the tendency to overcapitalize companies that don't need them, and would prefer to see them kind of run leaner, and in some ways have to have the struggle of being resource constrained, which I think is what drives like great companies, to be honest.
Yeah, we are on the same page on that. Seksom, I'm going to have to let you go. We will have you back to discuss your new role at Upfront Ventures and what your firm is focusing on. So have a good flight, and thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Shramana. I really enjoyed it.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.